After we'd done Footfalls at the Royal Court, Beckett and I talked about the possibility of doing Happy Days. I knew very little about this play, except it was the play in which Brenda Bruce had been buried up to her neck in arid earth. Now, as I began to read, I was immediately struck by the thought, how on earth could this man have written the story of my life so long before he knew me? Instinctively, I felt the play showed the universal human task of getting through the day. To me, this sometimes meant having to hang on by one's fingernails just to survive. By now, I knew enough about working with Sam to realise that to turn up at rehearsal without knowing my lines would be a waste of time for both of us. I wanted to use the 7 weeks we had together to work on the play. I went upstairs to the top floor of our house and made myself a cosy bed sit out of a spare room, which I called my snug. A place where I could just sleep and eat and read. Next door was a kitchen. That took care of my fuel, endless cups of tea. Every morning I had breakfast with Robert and Matthew, then I gave them a hug, fled up to my snug, and drew the curtains. At one point I rang Brenda Bruce. I asked her how on earth she ever learnt this damn thing. I suppose once you've learnt Happy Days, I said, you can learn anything. No, she said. After Happy Days, I felt I could do nothing. I've never recovered, even after all these years. It was the last time Beckett directed me in the theatre. He told me more than once, I'm not going to work in the theatre anymore, Billy. I haven't got the energy for it. I have one treasured memory of working with Sam on Happy Days. The play ends with Winnie softly humming to herself to the chimes of a musical box. Beckett scholars tell me that Sam had originally wanted Winnie to sing When Irish Eyes Are Smiling, but in the play's definitive version, it's the waltz duet from The Merry Widow that she sings. When we came to do it, Sam asked me, "Do you know this?" I answered yes, but he insisted on singing it to me from beginning to end in a frail, quavering voice. I felt so moved that when I sang it at the end of the play, I always tried to do it exactly as I heard it when he had sung it to me. He never knew that I was impersonating him as I sang so softly, "Though I say not what I may not let you hear, yet the swaying dance is saying, love me, dear. Every touch of fingers tells me what I know, says for you it's true, you love me so. One afternoon in 1980, while working on Passion Play at the Aldwych, my telephone rang. A man with an American accent introduced himself as Danny LeBay and asked me if I would appear in a new Beckett play in Buffalo. Buffalo? LeBay? Dan had written to Sam some time ago to ask him if he would please write a play for my university. To Dan's astonishment, Sam wrote back, "I hope this meets with your approval." Attached to the letter was Rockabye. Sam's favourite director, Alan Schneider, would present the play in Buffalo along with a short story called Enough. I spoke to Sam about Rockabye on the phone. As usual, he gave me the one decisive note I needed. He wanted the play to have the quality of a lullaby. He also said I was not to be afraid to make it sound monotonous. Rockabye is a one-act, one-woman piece for an old lady dressed in black Edwardian clothes with grey hair on which rests a little black hat, again, as in Happy Days, with a little feather in it, who rocks backwards and forwards in her old rocking chair, listening to her own repetitive thoughts. She only speaks a few sentences out loud. The rest of the lines are recorded on tape. They are her last unspoken thoughts as she rocks herself to death. Or does she? Alan Schneider had been very close to Sam. They were in harmony when they worked together, even when, as in Rockabye, they worked apart. Alan had directed the first production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and also the only movie Sam ever wrote, called Film, with Buster Keaton. I found working with Alan and Dan LeBay very stimulating, and I enjoyed our time in Buffalo. Robert came out to join me, bringing Matthew with him, who by then was 13 years old. From Buffalo, we went straight off to New York to do the Beckett bill at La Mama Theatre on the notorious Bowery off Broadway. For the opening of Rockabye in London, the Cottesloe was packed. People were standing at the back of the theatre, and even the director of the National, Peter Hall, found he couldn't get a seat. Robert, who knew Peter from the time he had been a critic and Peter ran the Royal Shakespeare Company, was happy to offer him his own seat. People seemed to want to see Rockabye. This may have sparked something off in Alan Schneider. Shortly afterwards, he was back in London with a new idea. Could we put Enough and Rockabye together with a revival of Sam's original production of Footfalls for a full Beckett evening in New York? Alan had already decided on the venue, Theatre Row on 42nd Street, where a new theatre was about to be opened next to the Harold Clurman Theatre. The idea was that our premiere would coincide with the opening of this new theatre. I would christen it the Samuel Beckett Theatre. At JFK, we were met by the producer, Jack Garfine. Jack had been married to the beautiful film star Carol Baker, who'd appeared in Robert's television play Paradise Suite. So although Jack didn't know me, he had met my husband. I'd been warned, and not only by Carol, that Jack, to put it mildly, sometimes tended to get overexcited by his projects. I was to grow very fond of Jack. He was a concentration camp survivor. It wasn't always easy to come to grips with his behaviour, an odd mixture of generosity, sensitivity, and somewhat eccentric business methods. On the way to the Algonquin Hotel, I asked Jack if we could pop into the shiny new Samuel Beckett Theatre so that I could conveniently drop all my costumes and makeup there. No, he said, don't bother yourself, Billy. We'll see to all of that later. When I arrived for a first rehearsal at the theatre the next day, I realised why Jack had diverted me. The Samuel Beckett Theatre was still in the process of being built. Still jet-lagged and overcome by the horror of it all, I collapsed onto a wooden bench outside the unfinished lavatory and tried to withdraw into sleep. All I wanted to do was to get out of New York, back to London, to be with Robert and Matthew. Having made it clear that I could hardly open in a non-existent theatre that didn't even have a dressing room, Jack reassured me all would be well, and indeed I was to find that overnight the place had been made almost habitable. My dressing room now looked like one of those prefabricated houses we had during and after the war. Someone had brought in an armchair, hung up my clothes, put up my photographs and posters, and laid out my rabbits and knickknacks. It came to the first night, February the 16th, 1984. As I put on my makeup, I waited for the familiar sound of an audience entering. I became aware of a deathly silence. I wondered what the hell was going on. Why wasn't I being called? I hurried through the empty auditorium to the front of house. I found quite a number of people on the sidewalk at 42nd Street just waiting. I thought I recognized familiar faces. I felt I had to be positive. Possibly all my repressed hysteria over the last days of rehearsal came bubbling up in me. In any event, I couldn't remember a single person's name. If I did think of a name, I attached it to the wrong person. I think I introduced Ruth Gordon to her husband, imagining she was Jessica Tandy, or possibly it was the other way around, who can tell? I got myself into one dreadful mess after another. Did I really say, Miss Gordon, have you met this wonderful actor, thinking I was introducing her to Hume Cronin as I held out my hand to Garson Kanin? And it was Ruth Gordon who told me very nicely, Yes, my dear, we have met. We're married. Robert has since claimed that I even introduced Glenn Close to her co-star Jeremy Irons, who was appearing in Tom Stoppard's The Real Thing, saying, "And this is a young lady who's doing very well in some theatre up the road." But I don't believe that. Luckily, the chaos had taken care of any first-night nerves I might have had. I had the feeling I was just rattling through my first-night performance in New York and that we were in for a dreadful flop. When the show was over, I started wiping the gunge off my face and put on a dressing gown. We then just sat around with cans of Budweiser waiting for the papers, the great American tradition. How often I've seen it in the movies. I continued to take my makeup off as everything suddenly went very quiet. Jack was standing on one of the wooden planks, his body slightly rocking, as he started to read out the first line of Frank Rich's review in the New York Times. "It's possible that you haven't really lived until you've watched Billie Whitelaw die," it began. I sat on the cold floor, grateful that we'd got through the craziest first night I'd ever experienced. I was quite content with that. Jack had clearly had his hour of fame and success, but it had long passed. He had suffered some dreadful blows in his professional and private life. Now he was reading words written by the butcher of Broadway that would mean that all his dreams were coming true at last. The review was a catalogue of praise, not only for Samuel Beckett, but also for the production and for me, and the other reviews were in the same vein. At the risk of sounding arrogant, I have to say that I have received good notices before, and I'd always thought, well, thank you very much, I've managed to skate over another bit of thin ice without being rumbled. A smash in New York, even off-Broadway, is unlike a success anywhere else in the world. Everybody now wants a piece of you, to share in this phantom called success. It did go on a bit. Jack doubled the price of the seats. We had garden chairs running down the aisles. We couldn't accommodate everybody. People were queuing for returns. I thought, good Lord, they do get excited here, don't they? And waited for things to simmer down so that I could get on with the run. I'd always known that American ballyhoo wouldn't agree with me. Had I done what young British actresses tend to do, to make for Hollywood the moment they've had their first success, I reckon within a couple of years I would have been dead. I understand why successful American actors have minders and an entourage. I also started to appreciate why some people who taste American success become addicted to it and can no longer bear to live without it. I'm afraid it filled me with fear and trembling. By now it was the middle of winter, and there was snow everywhere. A frail but undaunted Katharine Hepburn came to see me backstage. She'd broken her ankle and had a metal pin in it. She was so concerned about the weather that she sent her car to take me back to my hotel. I thought, what an incredible woman. Jack Garfine now started to drag me all over New York. He wanted desperately to find a new, bigger theatre. I know he meant well, but it all seemed quite crazy to me. To my mind, these theatres were totally unsuitable for Beckett, but beset by his gambling fever, Jack would say, "But Billy, look at the people we're turning away every night. I've got to go to a bigger theatre." He just didn't realise there is no big money to be made out of Samuel Beckett. That wasn't the way it worked. We'd done well, but I knew it would be right to leave it where it was. I told Jack, please, let's not go on charging all around New York looking for a bigger theatre. Let's just do the run here until I can go home. I could read the disappointment in his eyes, but he knew he wouldn't be able to change my mind. By this time, I just wanted to go home. New York had been a marvellous experience, and I wouldn't have missed any of it for the world. But it had confirmed in me what I'd always known, that this high-powered lifestyle was not for me. I needed domesticity, tranquility, and a bit of solitude. Before I went home, I did a week of Beckett in Los Angeles at the Mark Taper Theatre. Harold Clurman's widow, Stella Adler, the great teacher, beckoned me over to her table after the show and told me, "You must stop doing so much Beckett, my dear. You're too young to be working this close to death." While on a subsequent Australian tour with Beckett's play, something happened in Sydney which was to have quite an important effect on my future. The head of the university's English literature department asked me if I would talk to his students about Beckett. I had to tell him that I wasn't an academic, I'd barely been to school, and I'd never studied Beckett's work as a whole. When he persisted, I found myself one morning in a hall full of people having to talk about Samuel Beckett without a script or even notes. The professor came up to me afterwards and said, "Why don't you do this more often? For their work on Beckett, students need a personal link. What you can pass on is something much more direct than textbook theory." Evidently, young people were battling with dry academic books about an author whose work they had never seen come alive. It made me think. Much later, I was once more asked to talk about Beckett at Smith College in America for a 5-week semester. I was about to turn it down, but Robert dissuaded me. He worked out a structure of talks for me, giving me a set of cards on which he'd written summaries of my various encounters with Sam's work. This sent me hopping in the right direction. I still wouldn't allow the word lecturer to be applied to me, but I did agree to come and chatterbox. To my surprise, I find that I took to this new work like a duck to water. I was spontaneously bursting into renderings of Beckett's work, and I sensed that the students were warming to this unorthodox approach. It was 10 years later when the German producer Rainer Morris asked Walter Asmus, who had worked with Sam in Germany, to direct me in a triple bill of A. Joe, Footfalls, and Rockabye. It was in preparation for this production that Sam and I were to work together for the last time. We met in Paris and rehearsed A. Joe at the huge PLM hotel, which had been built just opposite his flat, an ultra-modern building crowded with Japanese businessmen. Inside the hotel there was a coffee bar which Sam liked, where we sometimes met in those late days. I noticed he'd become very frail. He wore a mustard-coloured beret and a greatcoat, and was no longer steady on his feet. It never occurred to me that after this meeting I would never see Samuel Beckett again. It was during one of our last conversations, when we discussed his radio play All That Fall, that I suddenly realised that Beckett, who hated to have his voice recorded, didn't know that he had an Irish accent. "She should have a bit of an Irish accent," he told me. I said, "A bit like yours." He said, No, a bit of an Irish accent." So I used a slightly stronger version of his own accent for Maddie Rooney. I realised that when Sam wrote dialogue, the music he heard in his head was Irish. Whenever I'm reading his work through for the first time, I either read it in my own North Country voice, or I use the voice in Sam's head, which he may not have realised was his own. On Boxing Day 1989, I had a phone call from Sam's nephew, Edward. As soon as Edward said the words, "Hello, Billy, this is Edward Beckett speaking," I knew what had happened. Sam had died just before Christmas at the age of 83. The funeral was very private. When it was over, Edward called me from Avigdor and Anne's house. My deep regret and sadness is that after he had gone into a nursing home, when his health had begun to deteriorate seriously, though we spoke a lot on the telephone, and he told me how nice it would be if I could come and visit him, and I had said, "Yes, I will," I left it too late. It took a long time for it to sink in that Samuel Beckett was dead. It was Christmas. One got on with the usual festivities and visits. I tried to get on with my life. For a long time, I carried a heavy weight around in my diaphragm. Even now, when I see a photograph of Sam unexpectedly, I get something akin to an electric shock. Sam's death was, for me, like an amputation. For 25 years, he had been a major part of my professional and personal life. I wasn't prepared for the hole his going would leave, a hole that can never be filled. His death had a more lasting effect on me than I would have thought possible. All desire to work ceased, certainly work I would need to take seriously. More than anything else, I wanted to potter around in the countryside and not have to think too deeply. The irony of turning down so much serious work was that in the end, I often accepted lighter, less demanding parts that didn't involve my centre. I was not happy with many of my performances at this time. I think I was bringing guns to them that were too heavy, not really needed. Robert and I had just moved to an idyllic spot in the Stour Valley in Suffolk. In 1974, we'd bought a small labourer's cottage there, and for 15 years used it for weekends and holidays. When the young writer Craig Brown, who lived in enjoyable chaos in the adjoining cottage, decided to move, he kept his promise to give us first refusal. We knocked the two cottages together and left London to live permanently in Suffolk, keeping a small flat in Hampstead for when I was working. After our nearly 30 years together, this was one of the biggest decisions Robert and I made. For neither of us was there any question of retirement. Robert wouldn't know what to do with his mornings if he had no writing to do. We simply decided to alter the emphasis of our lives. I became consumed with the beauty and variety of nature that now surrounded us. We got to know all the birds in our garden. Some of them were incredibly tame. The cheeky robins walk through the kitchen door, peck at the dog's food, and then walk out again. And the pheasants bang on the window if they want food. The Beckett Memorials in London, Paris, and New York, to which I contributed, were very important to me. I found them not only moving, but exhilarating. I found it unbearably moving to stand on the same stage as Madeleine Renaud, while her husband, Jean-Louis Barrault, not well enough to take part, sat in the front row. Both were to die soon afterwards, while I was writing this book. The memorial in London was held at the National Theatre. Peggy Ashcroft and Harold Pinter gave readings at the Olivier. As with the Barraults, it was probably Dame Peggy's last public appearance. A whole era in theatre seemed to suddenly have ended. I performed the last two stanzas of Rockabye, the last stage play of Sam's I had done. I was then asked to go to New York to read the end of Rockabye at the Lincoln Center. Time she went down, down the steep stair. Time she went right down, gently rocking herself towards death. At the end of the New York memorial, I locked myself in my dressing room and howled. Then I said to myself, well, that's it. I'm never going to perform Beckett again. Before Sam died, we'd often spoken about requests I was getting from universities in the States to talk about our work together. Sam had encouraged me while he was alive, but I knew I couldn't go on fumbling my way through my subject as I had been doing. Only gradually was I made to see that I had something to offer. I began to feel a sense of mission. I found I was putting as much effort into this work as into performing. I took the students on a journey I've made with a man called Samuel Beckett, a journey that was to last 25 years. I went on to tell them, I want to take you over this journey step by step and try and relive it with you. On my last evening at Dartmouth College in the States, I put together what I called an informal evening with Samuel Beckett, made up of selection of works Sam and I had done together, linked with anecdotes and stories of our preparations and rehearsal. Without being conscious of it, this informal evening gradually grew to become a self-made one-woman show that I've been able to do for charity and at colleges all over the world. Sometimes, as I sit in a cosy study in our funny little cottage, looking out over mile after mile of unspoilt Stour Valley, I'm reminded of the Marschallin's confessional monologue in Der Ossenkavalier, the first opera Robert took me to see, and the first record he bought me. If I have to write about myself, How can I do this with honesty? Who is this self, when I still tend to think of myself as an 11-year-old stuttering girl who can hardly string a sentence together, who lives on bread and scrape, who once a week at 10 minutes to 5 has to clutch the lavatory pan at the BBC North Region in Manchester, vomiting into the bowl before doing a children's hour that goes out live, telling myself, oh, please God, get me through this and I promise I'll never be naughty again. How can this self be the same person who is supposed to be a commander of the British Empire, who was appointed the first Annenberg Fellow at Reading University, who has scholastic awards and academic citations on her shelf, and who, thanks to Bradford University, can even call herself a Doctor of Literature? How very absurd, how unlikely. The worst piece of direction I think any director has ever given me was to tell me, just be yourself. It stopped me in my tracks. I still have no idea who myself really is. Like most people, particularly actors, I'm made up of many selves. Some of them aren't very nice. In Coventry, I apparently charged up and down along the garden fence, having imaginary rows with the little girl next door. I think the very first words I learnt after Mummy and Daddy was something like, I tell you, spoken with great force and determination. I was a bossy boots at 2, and I still am. I screamed and I stamped my feet. Nobody took the slightest notice. That was before I learned to be sneaky. Today I'm still apt to announce what I will do in a certain situation, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. Yet I know there is another side of me. In a real crisis, I will put other people's needs first. On any list of priorities before either Robert's wishes or my own, my son has always come first. Possibly a mixed blessing for Matthew. I don't blame anyone or any circumstance for anything I've done. The most positive influence in my character was the knowledge that I was loved at home. My father loved me until he died. My mother loved me all her life. There was a lot of things we didn't have when I was young, but the one thing I never lacked was love. All these bits that make up myself seem to be a jumble of contradictions. I'm not socially generous. I don't give many presents. Yet I've always tended to want to give things away. Mum had to rush down the street to tell neighbours, I'm sorry, Billy's given that away by mistake. It's her birthday present. Can we have it back, please? Getting on with my life on my own has always been high on my list of priorities. I can remember this being a conscious decision. In early adolescence, having been evacuated at the age of 7, my father having died when I was 9, my sister being away in the forces, and Mum out at Sharp's factory till all hours, I started training myself to be by myself. I feel that every part I've played has always been about me, certainly in the plays by Samuel Beckett. I seem to have within me not only the seeds of characters I play, but in real life, the seeds of being both failure and winner, depressive and optimist. Like most people, I'm a Jekyll and Hyde, often frightened and nervous, yet when I feel strongly about something, capable of being a leader and walking through brick walls without feeling pain. Viewing my various selves, I must confess to several negative characteristics. I can be extremely intolerant and arrogant, and have a tendency to write people off. I am judgmental, and in that I'm often quite wrong. I have an elastic view of my duties in life. I omit to do things that most people would do as a matter of course. My husband has written work for me which has been successfully produced, yet I've only read a fraction of what he's written. On the positive side, I honestly believe I'm not possessive with members of my family, with people I love. I need my own space around me, and I don't like people to enter it. I respect other people's space, and I don't enter theirs. I don't make social demands on other people, in return for which I won't let them make social demands on me. Everyone can do what they like, when they like, provided it is not assumed that I will join in. Solitude never depresses me. I'm quite often alone. I don't need people buzzing around me in order to function. Yet I certainly need to live inside a nucleus. That nucleus is Robert and Matthew and this cottage. Living in Suffolk is like being in the middle of a constantly changing painting. One becomes aware of the different seasons, the beautiful altering light. No wonder Constable was always painting this landscape and Gainsborough was content to live up the road. Surrounded by nature, by birds and rabbits, I feel at one with the earth, and I don't mind if the rabbits eat the carrots or the deer nibble at the roses. That part of me that identifies with the earth is also the part that stops me being afraid of death. I've always lived close to death, a bit too close sometimes. I lost my father, and I nearly lost the other two most important men in my life, my husband with a massive heart attack and my son with meningitis. By a whisker, Robert and Matthew are still here, but had they gone, I would have taken my own leave without regret. I promised my mother I would never let her die as painfully as my father had died, and had it come to that, I would gladly have given her the means to die without pain. I would willingly go to jail to stop Robert and Matthew from being assailed by unbearable pain, and when I have had enough of my own life, I want to go with a jar of Valium and a magnum of champagne. I don't consider it a sin to commit suicide. Though brought up to believe in God, I have no time for religious institutions. I've never been able to understand why the churches all over the world are so rich, apart from work of priests and certain rogue elements which seem to be frowned upon. Nor have I understood why, in so many countries, the churches have always supported right-wing dictatorships. I can't believe that is what Jesus Christ had in mind, nor can I remember as a child ever being told that we worshipped a Jew. I don't think Jesus Christ would have got very far had he been around in the 30s, or in our own day, come to that. As for politics, I can't understand why it's okay to make millions out of arms deals with dictators or from exporting death in the form of tobacco to the third world, where people are mostly ignorant of the consequences of smoking. Why are these dealers in death not hounded with the same rage as some politician whose extramarital affair may have produced life? Now, at 62, I often feel that despite the guilt feelings that never go away, I may have earned the right, within reason, to do my own thing in my own way. Earning a living, I feel I don't have to apologize if I spend some days doing nothing, just clutching a mug of tea and pottering around the garden. That is certainly what I like to do, first thing in the morning and last thing at night. I no longer feel driven, no longer feel the need to prove myself. I live in my own time warp. I've never felt that love and friendship have anything to do with the amount of time one spends with people, or with the number of miles one is apart. I feel I can transcend that if needs be. I've had a career which spans nearly 6 decades. I couldn't have started younger. I've gone from playing children as a child, teenagers as a teenager, young women as a young wife, middle-aged grandmothers, which is as it should be, though it does surprise me sometimes. When I look in the mirror at the external manifestation of what I am and have become, illogically, I still expect to see someone around the middle 30s, which is how I think about myself. I may well continue to do so until the day I die. I shall be only too happy to become a real grandmother. The process of aging concerns me no more deeply than the thought of dying. Getting old is in some way liberating. Luckily, in my career, I have never been given work that is based on looking glamorous. In my younger days, I became aware of something in my character which just blew where the wind took me. I think that is how I first got into radio and then into the theatre. That is how I fell into marriage to Peter Vaughan. That is why I moved with Robert to a big house in Camden Square in 1970, when what I really wanted to do was stay in my little house by the river in Datchet. That's why I accepted the part in Beckett's Not I, which at the time I read it, I would have given anything not to do. For the first 40 years of my life, I bobbled along like a piece of driftwood. In the second half of my life, I feel I've been incredibly lucky. To me, these precious years have been the happiest times of my life. It still astonishes me when I remind myself that I can do this and I don't have to do that. It's a heady feeling, like having drunk champagne. When I wake up at dawn and that grey cloud of work anxiety is there, I only have to get up and open the window to feel so free and happy. I've chosen to leave out quite a lot of what I have experienced in over 60 years of living. I haven't wanted to confess all my many sins or give away secrets. I haven't told tales that are nobody's business but my own. Some mysteries of the self, or selves, must remain unsolved riddles to the end, even to me.